Our guest today is Australia's leading dramatic mezzo-soprano Deborah Humble. After initial studies in Adelaide and Melbourne and advanced studies in Paris and London, Deborah was appointed Principal Artist at Opera Australia in 2002. In 2004, she won the coveted Dame Joan Sutherland Scholarship, and in 2005, she was appointed Principal Artist at the Hamburg State Opera. Since then, her performances have taken her all over the world, and she is particularly well known for her performances in the Wagnerian repertoire, including Erda and Valtrauta in the Ring Cycle. Deborah, welcome to Conversations at QYO.
Thank you, Simon.
Deborah, I believe we first met in Hamburg when I just started as Kapellmeister and assistant conductor at the Hamburg Opera, and you had been appointed principal artist. And I was trying to remember the first thing that we worked on. I think it was either Hansel or Gretel and the Magic Flute. Can you remember? And what were your first impressions of me as a young conductor?
I can remember. I remember very clearly because everything was so new and challenging and a little bit frightening. It was actually the Magic Flute. That was the first thing we did together. And you were there, and of course you were Simone Young's assistant.
Yep.
So that's what I remember. I remember you being very friendly and very helpful. And especially in the Hansel and Gretel, I enjoyed that.
That's a relief. To be honest, those first months are such a blur. Like, I don't think I'd never worked at such a busy opera house before, and so many productions simultaneously being rehearsed, working with Simone, who is an absolute, she never stops. There's always an absolute powerhouse. So I was often rehearsing her operas for her, and then I'd have to jump in and rehearse the operas that I'd been given to conduct as well. So absolute blur. And I just remember some of those performances, because we very rarely had rehearsal, right, with orchestra. How was that for you, jumping on stage and singing those roles without an orchestral rehearsal?
Well, it was a very big learning curve, slightly terrifying, and I knew I was coming to something called a repertoire house, but coming from Australia, I don't think I really realised what a repertoire house actually was until I got there. So rehearsing and learning maybe 3 or 4 operas at once, and then, as you say, this lack of rehearsal time was somewhat shocking. I think previously I'd done a few operas with Opera Australia, and we'd had maybe 6 weeks. Very leisurely, comprehensive rehearsal time, so everything felt very prepared. And here we were with a few bits of tape on the floor and a 2 or 3 days, and sent home with a DVD. I remember I had to buy a DVD player when I arrived because I realised that's how I was actually going to learn the productions.
So maybe for our listeners, you could quickly explain what is a repertoire house in the German opera system.
Well, it's a house which rotates productions, often over many, many years. And the other thing that really shocked me was this Magic Flute we were both involved in. I can't remember the year exactly, but I remember trying on the costume and literally sort of patting off the dust as it came out of the box and thinking, what is this? It was dusty and holes, and there was a list of about 25 names in the back of it from the people that had previously worn this outfit. And I think it was the 70s, maybe.
Yeah.
So these productions have often been around for a long time, and of course then they're adding new productions all the time, and it's a rotating series of operas, really.
It's like an opera factory, really, isn't it? Because I remember thinking Opera Australia was a big and busy opera company, and they do 22 operas a year in their busiest years, but Hamburg would do 35 operas a year, and they'd take their time if a production was new, right? We'd rehearse for 2 months, but once the production is in repertoire, the expectation is that you could pull it out like a book off the shelf and restage it with an absolute minimum of rehearsal.
And I think opera factory, I think that's a really good way of describing it, because as an artist, I was sometimes also a little bit perplexed at the I had these grandiose ideas that I was going to be able to interpret a role, or put my stamp on a role, which I was doing for the first time, and it wasn't really the case. You really had to slot it in to a preconceived production.
Yeah.
And it was the time factor meant that there wasn't a lot of room for expansion.
And often in performance itself, you're kind of in survival mode, just remembering where's my mark, where do I need to be next, conductor, orchestra.
I had a whole decade in survival mode. Well, you're dealing with a new language as well.
Yeah.
I did high school German, but that's not, I remember the first Magic Flute production call was the assistant director was speaking a dialect, a German dialect.
Yep.
And, really this was completely beyond me. And I was only grateful that I was third lady and that ladies 1 and 2 seemed to know what they were doing.
You just followed along. That would have been Herr Böcker, right?
Herr Böcker,
I remember
yes.
Herr Böcker.
Well, we got on very well at the end of the day, but I never really understood what he was saying.
Perhaps you're better off that way.
So there were all these challenges going on, and a new culture, completely new way of life in a new place, trying to make new friends, trying to also, having come from Australia, I don't know if you got the talk, but I was told we really had to be on our best game all of the time because we were foreign.
Yeah.
And we had to be up to scratch, so to speak. So I felt like I had this added burden.
I remember Simone pulling me aside once and saying, "Simon, the orchestra's happy with you, but you need to find your dark side. You need to be tougher with them." And I also remember a representative from the artistic committee of the orchestra coming to me and saying, "Simon, we like how you rehearse, but sometimes we're not sure you really want what you say you want." And I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, you're always using words like would you and could you and should you.
It would be nice if.
It would be nice if you could try to play a little bit softer first violins." And the Germans, who are just so direct, it's like, "Well, shall we play softly or not? Doesn't sound like he really wants us to."
Well,
so I very quickly learned how to say...
The imperative.
Exactly. Play soft. After that, I got along fine. Then you know what happened? I came back to Sydney and did a production with Opera Australia, and the principal second violin, Mark, said, "Simon, you're very brusque and direct these days." So the years in Hamburg, they're an absolute kind of freight train of amazing experiences, intensity. Let's go back a little bit to growing up in Adelaide. Like, when did you first think about a career in opera or as a singer?
Well, actually, I was a pianist, or I was a student of piano. So I started that when I think I was about 5, and apparently I came home from school one day where we had quite formal assemblies, and there was a lady who played the grand piano, and she played all the Anglican hymns and things. And apparently I came home and said, "I'd really want to do what that lady does in assembly." Mm-hmm. My parents said, "Well, what's that?" I said, "Well, she plays the piano." Mm-hmm. So I started piano lessons, and I loved the piano. But apparently I sang a tune before, or was trying to sing tunes before I even spoke. So somehow or other, I just always wanted to be an opera singer. I was always told that my grandmother's sister understudied Nellie Melba a few times, and Michael Lewis, who's a very well-known Australian baritone, is a cousin. Mm-hmm. And there was a lady called Ruth Gurner, who was a well-known South Australian contralto. So I'd always had these names thrown at me and said, well, maybe you're going to be like these other family members.
And that was an image then for you. You know, an interesting aside, sorry to interrupt, but on this very stage, this was actually Brisbane's very first concert hall. Before City Hall was built, long before QPAC was built, and Dame Nellie Melba sang 4 times on this stage. Oh.
So I had it in my head that, you know, I would like to be an opera singer.
And what was your image of an opera singer in terms of music?
No, I didn't have one.
Mm-hmm.
It's really interesting. Actually, I've just finished participating in a genetic singing study, which researchers are doing at the University of Melbourne. So Michael's been involved, and I've been involved, and other family members have been involved. So we did a series of tests, and they took our DNA samples, and I'm really interested to see the results, because wanting to be an opera singer and having no exposure to classical music or opera in the immediate family or at school whatsoever, apart from piano lessons, seems to me quite strange.
Unusual.
Yeah.
Did you sing in choirs?
Absolutely. So I was always in the choir. I used to put on solo recitals at recess and charge 5 cents.
So the entrepreneurial impulse is there as well.
When that was found out, that was shut down very quickly, that children should be spending their ice block money on Deborah Humble's singing. But, and so maybe I should have been an entrepreneur instead of an opera singer.
Was there any other musical activity in the family? Did your mum and dad?
No, I came from a very sporting, medical-based family background, actually. So your orchestral members will be far too young to remember this, but in the 70s and early 80s, there were things in houses called formal lounge rooms where you weren't really allowed to go unless it was a special occasion. And in that formal lounge room at our house was the record player. Mm-hmm. And we had 5 records. My mum had Shirley Bassey, Nana Muscuri and Helen Reddy.
That's not a bad collection.
And my father had various Elvis Presley albums and Acapulco. And that's why I became a clarinet player as a second instrument, just from this Acapulco album. But there was no opera. No.
Okay, well, that's something else we have in common, because my mum had an Acapulco album and I learned to play the clarinet.
Sadly, I never played clarinet like Acapulco.
With that nice wide vibrato. Not sure you'd be welcome in an orchestra.
A few little squeaks at the top.
And so then, as a teenager, were you slowly starting to listen to different types of music? You know, the opera company in Adelaide, were there performances there that you went to?
There may well have been, but no, that wasn't on my radar at all. So I studied the history of music at school as a subject, and I remember actually my favourite music, we did Shostakovich No. 5. Oh. And I became quite obsessed with Shostakovich and all things Russian for a while there. When I was 18 and I'd left school and I was already at the conservatorium on piano, I realised I wasn't good enough to be a concert pianist, and I was probably going to end up maybe in the repertoire direction or something similar. And I was a little bit tired, to be honest, as a teenager, of spending 5-6 hours a day in this tiny, pokey little room. And I thought there must be something better out there. I'd like to go to the opera. And so for my 18th birthday, I asked my parents if we could go and see Madame Butterfly, which was playing, and with, as it turns out, Rosamund Illing in the title role, and Warwick Stendyard's conducting. Yeah. And I had this image that we would get 4 tickets and that my mother and father and my sister and myself would go there for my 18th birthday, and they bought me 1 ticket and they dropped me off and picked me up when it was finished.
Was it any good?
Well, I was mesmerised because it was a very traditional production, and they had their Japanese kimonos on and the parasols, and it was very pretty. And I remember thinking, you know what, I think I'd like to do that. And since I was already having singing lessons, and that at that point I changed over. I thought that looked more like a team effort, I guess, or it looked like it was more fun. Yeah. And people had said, you have a voice, it's rather unruly, they used to say. It's rather unruly and it's a bit too out of control, but maybe we could do something with that if you were to focus on it.
It's interesting, the last person I interviewed for Conversations at QYO, one of our conductors, she said that her parents encouraged her to join an orchestra because they were pianists themselves, and they said it's very lonely and isolated, the experience of playing the piano, practice, and they wanted her to have that social experience in the orchestra. So that was a part of your opera.
And that's why I took up the clarinet, because I was the school pianist, but that was a solo thing. So as soon as I wanted to learn an instrument so I could be in concert band and an orchestra and small ensemble groups. And that was the reason I took up an instrument.
Do you regret playing the piano, or do you still use that skill now?
Every day. So I do quite a bit of teaching, especially since the COVID pandemic's been on. And so I play for my students, play all the exercises. And it saved me a lot of money in coaching fees, really, because I can learn my own roles at home.
At the piano.
And I don't have to take that elsewhere, and really until the very end stages.
They often say that pianists need to learn how to sing to create that illusion of singing on the piano. But is having that pianistic background, that understanding of harmony of many parts, is that useful as a singer?
Well, I think it is, but I don't know any different. Music is really a second language to me. It has surprised me at times as a teacher, when students come, and they have, wonderful voices. But if you talk about a sense of phrasing, for example, they're not quite sure what you mean. Or you talk about give and take in a phrase, or a sense of momentum, or, maybe you could shape it this way. And it would be nice if you shaped it this way instead of that way. And if they haven't had an instrumental background or a music education of any kind, I think that it's much more difficult, because it's not necessarily innate.
Well, when did you first start to get the feeling this is a pretty serious instrument and I can sing real repertoire with it?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and the honest answer is that I think I was vocally behind many of my contemporaries for quite a long time because of the kind of voice I had. So I sat back and watched other people having various successes, and because they had voices that kind of matched their age, and I'd sing and everyone would go, "Oh, well, that's very interesting. I wonder what we can do with that." Or could you make it a little bit smaller, because you're drowning everybody else out. I remember having a solo taken away from me from a nice Stedford, a solo in the choir, because it was just deemed to be, too unusual. And I'm very grateful for that dramatic voice these days, but it took me a long time to grow into it.
Is it a similar story to your, basso profundo, the big, rich, resonant bass voices, that the opera composers always write older male roles for those voices most often? Yeah. Is it similar in the mezzo-soprano repertoire, or once you get away from the Rossini style mezzo roles, did you have lots of people saying to you, "You'll be a great alto in 10 years' time"?
Yeah, look, in the beginning it was when I first started having a small measure of interest or success. People would say, "Oh, we can't put you in that role because you're too young," or "We can't put you in that role because your voice doesn't match the other people we've cast in the Mozart." So it was kind of like a waiting game, and I was often unsure of where and when I was ever going to find my place. And then when I did find my place, I got really disappointed, because all the roles for a voice like mine were old maids, ugly sisters, witches.
Opera's so politically correct, isn't it?
I just wanted to be a soprano, so wear a pretty dress, really, or, die dramatically or something. And it was actually Simone in around about, I guess it was about 1997 or 8, and I auditioned for her in London, and I took Erda, mostly because it didn't have any high notes in it, and I wasn't particularly confident with the high notes in those days. And I started singing, and she said, could you please put that music in a drawer for a decade, and we'll get back to you about that.
And she did. And
it was really 10 years pretty much to the day when I was cast in that first Wagner role. And and now I feel like I've kind of arrived vocally a bit these days, because I've finally grown into my voice.
Yeah. What's your advice to younger singers who are champing at the bit, are impatient, who are looking for the opportunities, the big breaks? When I was a younger conductor, I'd admire what seemed from the outside to be your patience. You seemed to always have that steady sense that my time will come, and I just need to put in the hard work and be patient. And it seems that is exactly what happened. But is that the way it felt to you? And
I was fairly impatient, but I gave myself little goals. Like, if I haven't done this by then, I'll do something else. And I very nearly did a couple of times. But I think in Australia these days it's really very tricky for, I say, young singers. Singers are not quite so young as perhaps instrumentalists are at the same level. There's so little work around in general. There's more now than there was 20 years ago, but there's so little work around. The temptation to say yes to anything that you're offered, both professionally but also financially, is very strong these days. And the courage, I think, the actual courage to say no to something that's not quite appropriate, yet, or you think you're not quite up to, is to be commended.
Is the better choice in the long run.
I think so. And I say that also to a lot of the young people I'm involved with these days is, you have to think, it's hard when you're 25, 27, 30 even, it's hard then to think about longevity. How long would you like to be doing this for? Would you like to do this for 10 years, or would you like to do it for 40? And, the voice is responsive to how you treat it. So if you overdo it now, you may not have the long career that you would like. And I think it's easy to say all that in with the benefit of hindsight, and much harder for young people to put into practice. But I highly recommend it.
Did you ever have a big break moment, or a moment where you thought, this is what I've been working for, this is it, after which things perhaps started to move a little bit more quickly?
Oh, look, yes and no. I mean, I think my career's been seems to me to be a series of things that got me really excited and seemed like big breaks at the time. Looking back, it was just a series of opportunities, I guess. I thought I'd made it when I became a young artist. Then I thought I'd made it when I sang at the Opera House in Sydney for the first time. That seemed like a very big moment to me, like a very big dream come true. A pinch yourself, this isn't really happening, is it moment. Then when I got to Europe, that was a big moment. When I sang my first, Wagner role, that was a big moment. When I sang with a particular conductor, that's a big moment. There are still big moments happening though. Mm-hmm. And I think for me, you just have to be grateful for all of these small things that add up to something that's been a life. And particularly, 18 months ago, I thought maybe I won't never sing again, because everything has been cancelled. No one is planning anything. The world sort of comes crashing down. And now I'm just even more grateful. I think every concert is a great big bonus now.
Are there any dream roles or works that you would particularly like to sing that you haven't had the opportunity to yet?
Yeah, I would love to sing Dalila, the Sanson. It's almost never done. It's done occasionally in the US. I would love to sing that role. Big, lush, romantic. I think she even wears a nice dress. I look forward to moving into some of the more. I have my first Clytemnestra coming up. Also not a particularly pleasant role, but certainly a really challenging one. Things like Herodias, Kundry, Venus, some of the bigger Wagnerian Zwischenfach roles. Santuzza, I'd like to sing Santuzza.
Oh, fantastic.
I'd like to revisit Amneris. I did it 10 years ago, and I would like to have another go at all those big Verdi things now.
You do both concert work and opera. How do you compare the two? What's the difference?
Well, apart from the obvious, costumes, staging, scenery, direction, I get a lot of pleasure from concerts, and there are practical reasons for that too. They don't take you away from home for so long. It's not a 6-week commitment. There's usually only 1 or 2 of them, and I like the immediacy of concert work personally. I like standing at the front of the stage, looking out and seeing an audience. When you're singing in an opera, most of the time you're not even aware there's an audience there, really, because you're interacting with other characters. So I quite like the thought that this is my interpretation of what I'm doing, and I'm giving it to you directly. And there's something about having a full orchestra right there behind you, not in a pit below you where you can't really see them. And it's just something right there when you do the Verdi Requiem and the whole, is it the Turba Mirum, I think, and the whole stage is vibrating with the percussion. That's exciting.
It's something that if you haven't played an orchestra, the fact that the concert platform, you can feel the vibrations of an orchestra through your feet. It's an absolutely thrilling experience.
I think some of my most memorable moments on the stage have been on the concert platform.
Mm-hmm. Can you describe for people who've never performed in an opera, I had some sense of what an opera singer has to deal with when, if a singer was ill during a stage orchestral, sometimes it was the poor assistant conductor who'd have to stand on the side of the stage and attempt to sing in the missing part for the other singers. I don't know if you were grateful when that happened or you just wished the assistant conductor would shut up. But, following a conductor with an orchestra down in the pit, you're blinded by all the lights, you've got to try and remember your production at the same time. Yeah. It's an incredibly disorienting experience, at least I found it to be. How is it for a professional?
It's sort of like doing this, there's so many things going on.
Because the orchestra, if you're hearing it at all, it's probably through the foldback speakers backstage.
And then there's please don't let me forget my words or don't let somebody else forget theirs. Is any part of my costume going to fail me? Is my wig going to fall off? No, I think it takes a certain personality to do all of that. To be fair,
keep all those plates spinning.
I think so, and to just then put it all aside if you can, and at the moment of the real performance, of the actual performance, to just do what you've trained to do and to just let everything else go.
For an opera singer, what is a good conductor?
If you'd asked me that years ago, I probably wouldn't have had an answer. But from a singer's perspective, it's a conductor that allows us to breathe. So it's a conductor that actually understands the voice, and not just a voice, but different types of voices, and that breathes with you and allows you the space for breath. And Simone comes to mind, actually. And there's a couple of others that sort of sing along. And that's a bit annoying.
That doesn't help, mate.
It's just a little bit quieter. No, but they're singing along, and they take the breath with you and understand that, it's all about the right tempo for a particular voice type, I think.
Yeah.
And someone who makes you feel confident. Remember when I did the Amneris, the Italian conductor in the pit made me feel like I could do anything.
Yeah, well.
And it was my first go at that, and there was most certainly I could not do everything, but he made me feel every time I set foot on that stage I was the best singer in the world. Like I could achieve, together we could just make this happen. And that is a very good feeling.
Put some wind beneath your wings, as it were.
Absolutely.
Wind in the sails.
And someone who makes you feel confident and capable.
You've sung Mahler's Third Symphony before, which is the work that we're going to be performing together in a month's time. The solo movement that the mezzo sings, the fourth movement, is right in the middle of the piece. It's a pretty quiet but also dark movement. What does the music mean to you?
Something different now to how it did in 2014 when I did it with the Queensland Symphony and with Johannes Fritsch. So I was revisiting it lately, and I thought, this is music for right now. So it is quiet, it's understated, it's lightly orchestrated, but it's also set to the poetry of the Nietzsche.
Zarathustra.
Exactly. And I was reading the words, the poem again, and it says, "O Mensch, gib acht," so men or mankind, humankind, pay attention. Deep is our woe. And I thought, wow, we do need to pay attention. Humanity does need to pay attention, and we are deep in woe. And what is the tiefe Mitternacht, or what is the deep midnight saying? And it reminded me of the doomsday clock, which is at midnight, and the fact that I think since 2020 we've been closer to midnight. We are closer to midnight now than at any other time since the Cold War.
Yeah.
And I don't know, just that picture of the doomsday clock, the deep midnight, and this we are woe. And there are so many things that are not quite right with the world at the moment. And I think for me, that's just for me, after the last couple of years, if you can impart a little bit of that into the music, then I think it can be very powerful.
That urgency.
I do, yeah.
Well, Deborah, I know the orchestra is looking forward enormously to working with you in a month's time on this absolutely mammoth orchestral journey. I'm thrilled that we'll be working together again after so long. Thank you for joining us on Conversations at QYO.
You are very welcome, and I'm looking forward to it too.